Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today at the BIM-XT Network. My name is Dana DeFilippi, coming to you from my home office in Virginia. For those of you who do not know me, I am a BIM technologist at Smith Group, advisor for the Revit DC user group, and speaker at national BIM conferences. 5 user groups across the East Coast have come together to bring you the BIM-XT Network. The network is run by a board of advisors to help guide the meetings. I must shout out Dan Warren. His name is new to this, but only because I forgot it for the last 6 months. So special shout out to him. He's pretty amazing, does some really amazing things in the background, and definitely pat him on the back if you get a chance virtually, of course. So thank you guys all for our advisory boards. We come together to basically want to make sure that these are all going to work for you guys based on a month-to-month basis. We're always coming out with new ideas. We try to plan these only 1 month and ahead. So once again, always fill out your surveys. We do use those in our Revit advisory board meetings as well. So on a side note, we do have a LinkedIn group. We will put up all previous meeting recordings and any information related to the session that we have to share. The group is also intended to foster conversations and connections among you, the participants, right? Kind of the native idea behind what we do in LinkedIn, right? Just basic idea of LinkedIn. So definitely check out our group. As you can see there, it is tagged there, 898045. I'm sorry, 0453. You can also find it through me. Hopefully you're my LinkedIn connection, and it's one of my groups, so you can find it on there. And you can see Ehsan just posted it in our chat, so thank you so much, Ehsan. So without further ado, today we have a really, really awesome presentation. Very, very excited about it. Rhino-Inside.Revit. And today we actually have 2 of McNeel and Associates. We're very lucky to have. First off, Scott Davidson. He's in business development at McNeel. You can find him on LinkedIn there. And also Ehsan. Ehsan is amazing. Hopefully you guys have heard of Ehsan by now. He is the Pi Revit dad. Should probably have him on here to talk about Pi Revit sometimes because it's an amazing tool that he gives away for free to everybody in our industry. He also gives away all of his Python source code and all kinds of wonderful information. If you're trying to learn Python, that's a wonderful start. You can also check out Your Desk University. Ehsan and I are going to be giving some Python courses. He's going to be teaching me Python, and I know nothing about Python, so you can learn with me. So without further ado, we do have, as usual, our randomly selected participant, and thank you so much for those of you who filled out our survey. Our survey participant today who won a $25 gift card is Michael. So Michael, someone from CAD Micro will be contacting you with that $25 gift card. Hopefully you spend it on something cool. Thank you guys, all of you who fill out the survey. Make sure you fill out the survey that you will receive sometime during this meeting within the chat, but also, of course, within an email after the meeting. And you could possibly win a $25 gift card. Without going too far into this, make sure that you do fill out the chat within Zoom. So down there within the bottom, you should be able to access the chat panel. That's what makes this so cool, is chatting with you guys. Make sure that you give us your questions, your comments, your feedback. Have you used Rhino Inside Revit? What's your experience? So we definitely want this to be a conversation with you, the participants, and our, of course, network of experts out there joining us on the call. So that's all I have. I will pass it right on over to Ehsan and Scott. Once again, thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Hi. So hi everybody. I'm Scott, and I'll be. We're gonna. I guess we'll give a little presentation today about Rhino Inside Revit. And then hopefully it'll be short enough that we have a long time to discuss, and Ehsan and I can answer any questions you have, whether about what we have or what we're working on or what our plans are, all those kinds of things. And just so you know, Ehsan's the Revit expert here, so I'll do my best as I struggle through this, and then we'll go from there. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, which is Revit. So let me just give you a quick kind of background as to what's happened and what Rhino inside Revit really is. So Rhino 7 was just released, I don't know, a couple months ago as a commercial product. So it's out of beta, it's in release mode. And Rhino 7 has kind of a special property to it in that it can be embedded inside other applications. And so, you know, there's a connection to Tekla, it runs inside of Unity and Unreal actually, you know, and it's different, there's different places, BricsCAD, things like that. But one of the most exciting ones, ones that we kind of did early on and discovered that it actually worked is we're able to now embed Rhino inside Revit's memory space. And so this allows not to just, you know, we're not transferring through file format or through some kind of named pipe. We're actually inside Revit. And so everything you can do in Rhino, you can do in Revit now. And all the plugins that run in Rhino and all the plugins that run in Grasshopper run in Revit. All the file formats that Rhino reads and writes, Revit can read and write now, and through the Rhino interface. And so it's you know, this is far beyond interoperability. We call it integration. So it's a true integration between two applications that now officially are one. And so we'll kind of take a look at that. This is supported on Revit 2018 through 2021. And what you do, what you need to have is Rhino 7. You have to have your Revit. And then you install a little stub that's free that you can download, Rhino Inside Revit. And what that does is that adds on the add-ins page here on the add-ins tab, you can see that you now get this little Rhino button. And so it's important to understand is that normally when Revit starts up, you'll get that button, but it doesn't use a Rhino license yet. And then once you click on this, it'll go through the process and it will try to load Rhino in Grasshopper inside Revit's memory space. And it's successful doing that, it will come up with this toolbar. And there's different things that you can do here. You can start Rhino, which we're going to do here in just a second. We can import 3DM files directly to using our 3DM importer as opposed to the one that comes with Revit. And we can do things like categorize things and put different direct shapes and categories and things. We can turn off and on preview. We can actually edit Python here. This is actually the Rhino Python editor, but the Rhino Python editor can access both the Revit API and the Rhino API simultaneously. So you can actually write Python scripts now that include both APIs and both calls, and you have the whole of the Rhino geometry kernel available to the Revit API in Python and in C# for that matter. So we can start Grasshopper and some other pieces here. We also have what we call a Grasshopper player, which some of you might be familiar with players in Revit, and so that you can write commands with Grasshopper and just play them, and that works too. Another important piece of this, as we talk about PyRevit, PyRevit has the ability to make custom toolbars, and those custom toolbars can include both Python and Grasshopper and Dynamo scripts. So you can actually create your own custom toolbars with all your custom routines too with PyRevit and Rhino Inside. So let me just kind of show you how this works really quick. When you start Rhino, you hit here and it starts up Rhino here. This is just standard everyday Rhino 7, but it does know it's running inside of Revit. And so when I start up Grasshopper, there's a few new toolbars that come up with Grasshopper when you're inside Revit. So this is Grasshopper running inside Rhino inside Revit. So it kind of starts to understand the stack there. So you can see we have Revit primitives here, different kinds of Revit primitives that we can access directly through Grasshopper. We also have a Revit toolbar that comes up, which has things like being able to add beams and columns, deal with categories, create direct shapes, deal with families. We can do, we can actually interrogate elements, things like we have a really extensive way of working with Revit materials directly. So you can actually use Grasshopper as a material editor in Revit, which is kind of fun. We can deal with parameters and different bytes here. We have a whole section on walls because walls themselves are a fairly sophisticated category or family. And so they have their own kind of piece here. But you can see, and we keep adding to these. These are things that we continuously add to. So there'll be more and more of those. But so that's where you kind of find how you can do things in Revit. And so let me just open a example here so you can kind of get an idea how this works. I think we'll start with this one here. And so I use a lot of one of the things we're trying to solve at the very start of this was people were complaining and wondering, how do I get my Rhino geometry? A lot of people use Rhino for design. How do I get my Rhino geometry and move it into Revit? And so this is kind of the initial question, and we can do that in a number of different ways. And this is one of the nice parts about this connection now, is that you can do it with direct shapes. I have examples where we're throwing 100,000 elements into direct shapes. It's very, very quick. You can use them in drawings really quick, for a competition or something like that. But we can also be more rigorous or intentional on how we get things across. And so in this case, what I have is let's say this is a canopy here that's custom built. It's going to be dropped out on site. And one of the things I need to do is I have these footings that we need to have the footing person kind of put in. And then we're going to have this other piece fabricated and we're going to drop that in. So the Grasshopper definition can actually reflect that. And again, I'm using EllaFront, which is a plugin for Grasshopper that's free. And it goes through and it allows me to select objects by type over in Grasshopper or Rhino. So in this case, I'm grabbing all the B-reps. I'm finding everything on the foundation layer, which are all these concrete pieces there. And then what I'm doing is by going to family here, I can create a new component family. So that's right here. And the new component family is going to be a structural foundation template here. You can see that. And it's in the structural foundations category. And then it's named canopy footings. And so what it does is it takes all that geometry, wraps it up in a new family. Of course, those of you that are really familiar with Revit is that you don't insert families, you insert types. And so we have a little unit here that goes and finds the types in this family, which is only one because it's a component family. And then what we can do is we can insert that family into Revit. And so you can see here that we have these footings here. They're a component family. Each one of these could have been an instance, by the way, of a single type, but in this case I was lazy and I made them all one. But you can see we have the canopy footing here. It's structural foundation type. And what I can do, which is really interesting here, is because these are B-reps in Revit now, I can actually edit this family here. I can grab these objects, and there's some light editing that I can do to these, even if Grasshopper and Rhino weren't around. I could do this. Now I'm not going to save this change because of course Grasshopper is in control right now. It'll just change it right back. And I can disconnect that connection. But you can see that I can make, real families with real geometry through this. And so I'm just going to close this, and we'll get back to the overall model, hopefully. And so there we go. So now let's take a look back at a little bit more about this definition. So I'm over on this side, and so there's a lot more happening in the rest of this. I've got some roof panels and some columns and things like that. And so what I can do here is I can actually, using EllaFront and some other filtering, we can go through and I can actually say, here are the layers of the objects in Rhino. And then I can map those to subcategories in Revit. And so here's the subcategories I'd like to use right here. And in fact, I can actually assign materials to those objects too. I do a little sorting of those. And then by going to, I can create the subcategories if I need them. I can also create the material names if I need them. If they don't exist, they'll get created. Then I push those all into essentially a form mixer, mixes all the subcategories with the forms and all those pieces. Then we get to the family again, a new family. This is on a site family because I'm going to use subcategories. So I got to find a category I can use subcategories on, or a family I can use subcategories on. We're going to call it walkway. I mix that all up, find the type like I did before, and insert it. And what I get over here is I get a family here with all the different subcategories and pieces like that. And then you can see what I can do here is I can go through and we can actually, using subcategories, I can, let's see what I get here. I can go through and actually change graphically how these things look and based on the different subcategories and using view filters and all those things. And so you get to the, you can really start to inform the model, the BIM model, create the BIM model in a way that works well in your Revit schema. And so that's one of the big advantages you have here. And of course that can change over time, you know, like you might, for instance, have floor plates that are going across and are official, but you might be using, like, you might still be working on the facade. So the facade might be direct shape objects, you know, which you're going to just use temporarily until the facade kind of settles down in the design. So there's a lot of options here for your workflow. Now, we don't just do forms and we don't just do direct shapes. We can also drive native families, system families. So I'm going to just jump out here and show you how we might do that a little bit. And I'll close this. And I think we'll leave that one open for right now. Let me close this and get on to a different template here. So when you move on to doing native objects in Revit, a lot of times instead of just moving the geometry over, you're actually going to move a piece of geometry in Rhino over that has, and by the way, this is not just the geometry, this is all the parameters too. So you can add all the data that you want from the Rhino model into the Revit model if you want. But you might just move a curve over, for instance. And so let's open that up a little bit. Take a look at that. So I'll open, let's do, yeah, that looks about right. All right, so this is, you can see here, instead of having all the geometry, we just have or all the final geometry, we just have some curves and points and things like that. And so I'll go to a different way. In this way, this one is going to, instead of just taking geometry over and making families, it's going to go and actually drive some pieces, or some native objects, some system families. So in this case, I'm going to take some floor curves, and I'm going to move along here, find all the curves on floor and all the curves on roof. And then what we're going to do is I'm actually going to find the name on those curves, and I'm going to find the elevation of the curves, and I'm going to create a new Revit layer. So we go over here to, I have our level. So I have a level here. I can add a level, and then it creates that level, named that. And at the same time, it's going to create a floor, which is a native floor using a standard type in Revit. Here's all the types that happen to be in this model. And then I'll just enable this here. And so it's interesting what happens here. So it takes those curves, which I could have picked, but I just filtered for them on the layer. It creates those curves, or it takes those curves, it creates the native floors in Revit here. You can see they're native floors. You can't tell that these weren't created. You can't tell that these weren't just created by hand in the first place, actually, except Grasshopper's in control at this point. And if I do, what's interesting too is then those floors are actually previewed back in Rhino. So it's the curves in Rhino, the floors created in Revit, exist in Revit, and then it's previewed back in Rhino, which is kind of fun too. So you can see how they're both updated all the time. What's nice about this is, you know, if we were to disconnect Rhino and Grasshopper to this and somebody wanted to change this, I can go and, like I did before, is we can pick on this. I can go and I can edit the, I can edit this floor. Let's see here. Oh, I can't edit the floor right now because...
Scott, I think you have to unpin it first.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah. See, I got to remember all these things. That is an important piece of this is when Grasshopper creates objects, everything in Revit is pinned. And so the if you want to edit it, you unpin it, and that way you can get to it directly. And then we can edit the boundary, and you can actually see if I go in here and I click on this, I actually have the ability, you know, it actually gives me the dimension. And so I could edit that, and it actually edits with Revit. And so that originally, of course, was a Rhino curve. But let's say that you disconnect Grasshopper and it's gone downstream in the project further, you know, that's you have this kind of ability depending on how you make the thing. Again, I'm not going to save that change because Grasshopper is actually still in control. But we're just going to do that. And so I'll just disconnect that edit. But that is the kind of level that you have. So we can do floors, and these levels here were created by Rhino and Grasshopper. Grasshopper named them and created them on the fly. So you can kind of keep all that in sync. This also goes the other way. You can take levels and bring them into Rhino if you want to, all that kind of stuff. Just the last piece I want to show here before we get on to your questions and answers, because we want to make sure you have a lot of time to do that, is we can do things like I just take some points out of here, and I can create some columns with them. So the points that were in Rhino here, you can see they're right here, and they just created the columns. What's fun here is if I am in Rhino and I edit this roof height, you can see that the columns in Revit respond. So you can set up some active ways of these two working together. Another way you can do this is if I want to take, I want to drive adaptive components. And so we'll just go in here and I'll enable this. So we can drive adaptive components through Grasshopper. And that'll just take a second to populate. And so you can see that in Grasshopper, or in Revit, the adaptive components were created here. Excuse me. And then if I come in here, we can have some fun with this. These are previewed. I can come in here, instead of using the same adaptive component, what I can do is have Grasshopper randomly place two different adaptive components. And so you can see that it can just randomly do this, or you can have it react to where it is on the facade and have Grasshopper select different adaptive components on the fly and have it edit those things. And in fact, I have a little slider here that will look at different random patterns that you can go back to. So if you want to go through and look at different patterns, in this case, this is Grasshopper driving Revit's adaptive components real time. And so there's a lot of options here, but what's nice about doing some of the methods this way is, of course, these are system families, just standard Revit system families that and creating real Revit objects. So Revit's doing the generation of the geometry. And then all the parameters that come along with it. That's all possible. So anyway, so that's just a quick overview of some of the things you can do. I want to, if you're interested in more of this, I want to be the Rhino Inside Revit website is the place you want to go. And I want to point out two different places. There's three, I guess. There's Getting Started article. That's where you can get it started. Talks about install. There's guides. These guides are all the different, talk about, for instance, how we deal with walls in Revit, how we deal with doors and windows in Revit, how we deal with adaptive components, different pieces like that, how we deal with rooms and areas and spaces. And we're still working on this website, but and then from right here is, Rhino to Revit. This is the most popular guide by a long shot. And if we go in here, it talks about how to create direct shapes, how to create loadable families with subcategories, and how to do native Revit elements. And a lot of what I showed here today is in this guide. And so you can go through this, but it also has some, talks about the different pieces and what you can do. And so I highly recommend, as you're exploring this, is get to this guide, and you can kind of work from there. Another thing that we have, which this video may end up on at some point, is if you go to Discover here, there's lots of different resources here from people in the community, different demonstrations, different tutorials, different discussions about how it's useful, all those kinds of things. Some people you will recognize because they've been on your cast here. And so, and we continuously are adding to this. So that's the Discover page and a great place. You can see that Marcelo, which I think he talked about a few months ago to all of you. There's a Revit Grasshopper for Revit manual, and includes Dynamo too. And that is right here. But there's a lot of other resources too. So I just want to make sure people knew kind of what the important selections were. The forums, if you want to get a hold of us, are right here. And we're on the forums all the time. So anyway, so that's what I have for this presentation. How about some questions?
Well, and actually, before we get started with our conversation, I'd love to share or actually get some responses from you guys in terms of some poll questions. So first off, a typical one, right? Where are you joining us from? And it's a little late. That's okay. We're going to do some polls together. Let's give you guys a few seconds to answer this. Looks like the majority of us are responding northeast of the U.S. Some of us are from the Midwest. That's cool. Some Europe. I'd love to hear from where in Europe you're calling from. It's awesome. So I'll go ahead and share those results for a second. And then the next one that I want to ask you guys, of course, is what discipline do you represent? Get a little bit of an idea from that so we can maybe have a little bit more of a pointed conversation. Mostly architecture, some other. I'd love to hear what the other is in the chat and where in Europe you guys are calling from. So share those results. So 59% architecture, pretty standard, right? We architects, we like to use Rhino and early design, right? And then lastly, more pointed to this conversation, of course, which of the following have you used? So may surprise you, but I have actually only used Dynamo, which it looks like it's a pretty good response here as well. Pretty heavy-handed response. So most of you are like me. Maybe at least utilized Dynamo in some fashion, which is very cool. Give you guys another second or so to answer that and share those results. So as you can see, 78% of us have utilized Dynamo. I would say that this is definitely a good reason for us to start utilizing or learning Rhino and Grasshopper, right? And as was mentioned in the chat. There's tons of resources to learn these types of things, both from the Rhinoceros website, but also from YouTube, Lynda, which is now LinkedIn Learning. Some of you guys can get that, as was mentioned, free with your library card, which is super surprising and awesome. But of course, some companies provide this as well. So definitely look into your company if you're unsure, especially if you work for a larger company. And of course, you can always Google it. There's so many resources out there. Looks like we have somebody from Luxembourg. That's awesome. All right, so looks like we do have a few questions in there. I'm a little behind. Let's see here. Jason is asking, has anyone used Rhino or Grasshopper for MEP? If so, what are some examples? Ehsan, Scott, have you guys seen any MEP integration of Rhino or Grasshopper or Rhino inside Revit?
So we have the Rhino, basically a forum endpoint on the Rhino forums for Rhino inside Revit specifically. So every once in a while, there's a couple of questions about like getting some ductwork modeled and stuff like that. I don't know off the top of my head if somebody has made an introduction or a video specifically for MEP stuff, but it's definitely one of those things that, you know, we get questions about.
Omar has a really good question. Many of us, if not all of us, have transferred a lot of our information over to BIM 360, utilizing cloud sources. You know, obviously a lot of us are working from home or wherever we might be. So are there any caveats when utilizing families, models, links stored on BIM 360, I guess utilizing Rhino inside Revit?
So one of the things to know about BIM 360 is that it's generally a cloud storage space for Revit models. So as long as you have the model loaded in Revit, just like the local model you have, the information about the model is inside your memory, inside your machine's memory. So Rhino inside Revit can completely freely play with those models, just like it can play with local models. It actually, the way like BIM 360 works is that it caches the cloud model to your machine. So it's really a local model. And then all the linked and stuff are also synchronized using the Autodesk desktop connector. So those are also local models. And we have components that you can interrogate and inspect the linked models that are attached to a document that you're working with. You can actually interrogate those linked models, get walls and elements and stuff like that queried from a linked model as well, if you want to. So we have a pretty good support for the different platforms that Rhino and Revit can store its models, and also anything that's linked to it, basically.
Somebody's asking, confirming Rhino Inside only works with Rhino 6 and 7.
So Rhino Inside depends on a new piece of technology that's introduced in Rhino 7. It's not going to work with Rhino 6. The Rhino 7, the developers for Rhino 7 sort of like took apart a good piece of Rhino and put it back together in a different way. So it could be embedded in other applications as well as sort of like an add-on. Rhino Inside Revit was built on this technology that's available in Rhino 7. It's really asking Rhino to load itself inside the Revit environment, and it also launches Grasshopper. And this Rhino Inside Revit piece that we talk about is really the add-on for Revit that sort of like can talk to the installed Rhino that you have on the machine, get it to load inside Revit, load Grasshopper, and it also adds all these components that Scott showed you. These are the components that come as sort of like packaged with Rhino inside Revit to be able to support Revit workflows inside Grasshopper.
Yeah, and we joke about it all the time, but there's a little secret. The little secret is that Rhino actually is Rhino inside Rhino. It calls itself to load itself. So what's nice is that all the technology we're using for Rhino inside in Revit is something that we use ourselves for Rhino, and so it allows it to get tested and all that kind of stuff, and keeps it up to date, which is really nice.
There's another question then about work sharing that Dan is asking. These same work sharing rules apply. One of the, as like Scott showed you, the focus, our focus is really with Rhino inside Revit is to be able to build as many components and workflows that would support creating and querying native geometry in Revit. So the goal is not to sort of like bring all these crazy shapes and geometries and stuff like that inside Revit that Revit really doesn't understand. The goal is to be able to give you the amazing Grasshopper and Rhino geometry engine that sort of like exists outside of Revit, bring it inside the Revit environment so you can use this visual programming language and the geometry engine to generate a lot of the content that you need inside Revit automatically, all the walls, levels, floors, and all that kind of stuff. As an example, theoretically, you can have a Grasshopper definition that will set up a new project for you. Let's say you work in a company and you want to set up a Grasshopper definition that every time you, I don't know, start an office project or something like that, it'll ask you a couple of questions about the levels and about the number of sheets or arrangements and all that kind of stuff. And it would fully customize the template Revit model that you started with to sort of like prepare the project for you. This is just an example of like how it could be used in the real world. You could use it as, if you're an architect, you could use it as a design tool. You can use Grasshopper inside Rhino without Revit to design any sort of like, let's say you're designing a very complex shell for your building and stuff like that. Grasshopper is extremely popular in free-form architectural design. This Rhino inside Revit bridges the gap between those sort of like workflows and Revit. So now you can open the same definition that you had inside Grasshopper in Rhino inside Revit, see your full Rhino model in Rhino, and then add a couple of Revit native components in there that would translate and sort of like bring that into the Revit environment the way you want it to be. So these are like a couple of examples that make it super powerful. But because of this native geometry and all that basically stuff that Revit knows what they're about, everything else about them, phasing, design options, work sets, everything else works just like usual. When you create some content using Rhino inside Revit in Revit and synchronize that with everybody else that is using the Revit model in the other side of the world that they don't have Rhino inside Revit, there is no conflicts. It's just Revit content that you're sharing. So there's no problem sort of like working with everybody else that don't have Rhino inside of it. It's not going to make your models dependent on the add-on.
Looks like there's a question from Victor. Are there any core apps like EllaFront that are recommended within the Grasshopper environment?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, Scott. That's a question for you.
Yeah, I can take that. So we're finding that there are certain plugins that are really useful, and so EllaFront's one of them. And the reason EllaFront is useful is that it gives you the ability to filter and add attributes, additional attributes, key value pairs to Revit or to Rhino objects. And so what it allows you to do is you can actually take information from Revit and attach it to the objects in Rhino, or you can take the objects in Rhino that have additional information, and you can actually make those parameters in Revit. And so it gives you that geometry and data combo in Rhino that you're used to in Revit. And so I think that's where EllaFront's been really useful in its ability to actually be able to manage that data in Rhino in the same way that you might use it in Revit. And so it allows, one of the things we found is that the designers are actually, making a lot of decisions about the what the material might be, how things are put together, what the index numbers might be, things early on in the model, in the LOD 200, they're making a lot of decisions. And now with EllaFront, they can embed that information in the Rhino model. And then when it's ready, kind of starts working with Revit, all that information get transferred, so you don't lose that information. So EllaFront's one of those things that works really well. Another one that we're seeing a lot of mileage with is paneling tools. So paneling tools allows you to take poly surfaces or very complex shapes and break them down into grids or rationalize the shape like you want. It goes far beyond just UV of a surface like you can do in most products. And so paneling tools is a really, really great product or plugin that we're seeing very popular. Another thing, I mean, of course, everything in Grasshopper, all the plugins run in Revit. So you know, we can go on and on about this. Another place is Human UI. So Human UI allows you to create custom dialog box interfaces using Grasshopper. And you can, with the Grasshopper player, you can run those and only the dialog box pops up. So you can make interfaces that don't involve Grasshopper at all in terms of the user interface piece. But as you input those things into custom dialog box, then it would generate the object in Revit. So they're just three ones that we'd probably recommend looking out for, you know, in terms of they have been really useful for Rhino inside Revit.
Dana, sorry, I'm jumping in. There are a couple of really
I love it.
there are a couple of really good questions coming in that I kind of want to address. I'm going back to Dan's sort of like question and something to think about, which is the relationships that are formed between Revit elements, like hosting. Like if you have an element that's hosted on somebody else, on some another element. What I generally like to advise. These relationships, obviously, somebody creates a wall and you use Rhino inside Revit to place a few instances of, I don't know, let's say fixtures and stuff like that on that wall, and the original walls gets changed by the original user, it's going to affect the content that you have, just like normal Revit. My generic advice is that always, if you have relationships between Revit elements, bring that relationship logic into your Grasshopper definition. So place that wall using that Grasshopper definition and place the rest of the stuff on the wall on the Grasshopper definition. This way, every time you make changes, the whole relationship and the models and everything else gets generated. That was one. And then there is another question about the add-ons that Scott extensively talked about. Pretty much everything that works with Rhino and Grasshopper works inside Revit now. There's a question that kind of might cause a little bit of trouble here is that, like, what are the key functions that Rhino inside Revit has that Dynamo doesn't? Whenever this question comes up, I prefer to talk about things that that Grasshopper and Rhino have that are sort of like unique, and they're kind of very well known for what they, you know, for these properties. There are four of them that I usually list. Rhino is very intuitive, is easy to use, is a generic modeling application. So you can model anything you want. Specifically, Rhino7, the new version, supports subdivision modeling, which is a free-form kind of like parametric, fully accurate mathematical surface modeling, which is, you know, pretty amazing. So that I don't know any other architecture package that allows you to use subdivision modeling. This effectively brings the power of subdivision inside the architecture design. The Rhino's geometry engine is the second one, which is an incredibly powerful, fast geometry engine that you can do anything you want with. I do this often, that I grab something from Revit, take it to Rhino, do all the cuts or whatever that I want to do, or analysis that I want to do on the geometry, because Rhino has all this stuff built into the geometry engine, and specifically the Rhino common, which is its API. So you can access all the Rhino's functionality through its API. This is sort of like, Rhino is so well built that pretty much everything that you see in Rhino's user interface is using the API that's accessible to you to do whatever it needs to do. That's number two. Three is Grasshopper as a visual programming environment, which is insanely popular. It's very beautifully designed, very intuitive to use. It has a scripted components and everything else. So it's by far, to me, at least, it's a lot easier to use than the comparable products. And the fourth one is Rhino's support of many different file formats, over 40 plus file formats that you can support. All of those are accessible to Revit now. You can import those models from anybody else that's coming inside Rhino and use Grasshopper and the Rhino inside Revit to translate all this geometry into Revit the way you want to. One of them specifically is Rhino's original file format, which is 3DM. 3DM is an open file format. So unlike Revit file formats that if you don't have Revit, you don't have access to your data, 3DM is not like this. If you don't have Rhino, you have plenty of powerful libraries and stuff like that that you can read and write this open 3D file format. There are even like, web-based viewers for this for the content and stuff. So if you store this and like 5 years from now, you still need those geometries, you will have access to those to that information freely.
And anything that you can share in terms of things that are coming out that you guys are working on at McNeel that maybe we can look forward to?
Oh yeah, so Scott, should I talk about the element binding?
Well, I was going to talk about, yeah, well, how about I'll do the geometry, you can do element binding. We'll do that. So something that just came out, well, there's two things that came out just last week and this week. So one is, as some of you may know, it's like walking on eggshells when you're trying to load plugin in Revit. So it's, there's conflicts between plugins and things like that. And we've been working very hard to be nice enough that we don't conflict with other plugins. And so last week we actually released a new build that's been a lot better. So anybody that's tried it in the past and had trouble with it loading last week's build, download that, and that'll help a lot. The next thing that we released just earlier last week, and we have another build probably coming out maybe tomorrow or the next day, is that helping get Rhino geometry into Revit. Revit's got an old, I think it's an old ASYS modeler. So it can be pretty picky about geometry, especially inside families. And we have a whole bunch of ability to massage the geometry coming out of Rhino so that it gets into Revit and it doesn't mesh. It actually becomes a B-rep. And that's a new build that we're just currently been releasing last week, but we have a new update, which is pretty cool, coming out next couple of days. So those are two things that have just come out and we've currently been working on. And then Ehsan has.
Yeah. So if you install and take a look at the Rhino inside Revit, all the components that we have in the Revit tab, you'll notice that we have a lot more query and analysis components that we have as compared to create components, as we like to call them. Components that let you create native Revit content inside Revit documents. We have plenty, but there's still a lot of work to be done in that department. Part of the reason is that getting stuff inside Revit model and make them sort of like in a way that the Grasshopper can drive them, and it is intuitive for the user, so they can tell the Grasshopper, hey, it's okay. I can take care of this piece of content from now on. And also, when another instance of Grasshopper opens in somebody else's machine somewhere else, it can recognize that piece of geometry, that piece of model that is Revit native is not something that sort of like Grasshopper itself creates. It asks Revit to create that. So that has been always a challenge. We're calling this feature element binding, the way Grasshopper remembers the content that it creates. This feature is sort of like we are in the testing phase of it, so we should be able to publish this out soon. And once this feature is inside Grasshopper, then we will be able to sort of like focus on a lot of create components, because now we have this element binding as a backend, and it would be also accessible to all these scripted components that we have. So if you generate stuff inside Rhino inside Revit, the scripted components that you have will remember all the content that they created, so they can replace them. This ties back to another question that showed up, is that, hey, if you run the Grasshopper definition, does it delete or update the existing component that it created? It really depends on what kind of workflow and what kind of Revit element you're dealing with. The default action is that it's going to delete and replace it with something else. But in a lot of cases, like for example, if you change the property of an element, it's not going to delete the element. It's going to modify the property. So you can easily adjust the height of a series of walls without really deleting them or affecting anything that's posted on it. A couple of these examples are sort of like this, like maybe the base curve of the wall can be replaced without actually deleting the wall. This update sort of like option is heavily dependent on what Revit API actually allows us to do. A lot of content in Revit can be created, but they can't really be updated after they're being created, other than properties. So in a lot of instances, you kind of have to delete it and recreate it. But if you kind of follow that advice that, hey, put all the relationship logic and the material and stuff and the components and elements that you want to generate inside the Grasshopper definition, then there shouldn't be any problems. Like every time you run your Grasshopper definition, you get a new instance of that content. And we have a couple of really good components inside the Grasshopper that are specifically built for this. Scott, do you mind showing them the trigger component that's sort of like new to Grasshopper? So this trigger component that I think inside utilities, this one. This component, you can actually tie it to any other component in Grasshopper, and it specifically works very well with Rhino inside the Revit aware components. So it kind of ties the actual function of that component to that play button that's there. So you can do a whole lot of like calculations and geometry modeling and stuff like that inside your Grasshopper definition. Check it out in Grasshopper, make sure it's good, and then hit the play and let the rest of the definition take care of that, sort of like building all that stuff inside your Revit model. So you can sort of like very nicely separate these two pieces from each other, or have like multiple pieces even inside your Grasshopper definition. So it's sort of like, you don't have to have Revit as a bottleneck all the time, because it's going to take more time for Revit to generate this stuff. You can easily play with them a lot faster in Rhino and just click on it when you're ready.
Yeah, and so in my case, in these demonstrations, what I do is I might take the Revit component and disable it, and then when I'm ready, I'll just enable it, and it'll generate the Revit objects. And so you can do it that way too. But this trigger is pretty nice because you can wire it up to as many components as you want, and you can trigger them all at the same time. So.
One other question that I have, especially because we have a lot of Dynamo users like myself on the call. And I feel like that's actually, I feel like when I ask that question, especially to computational users, it's actually the exact opposite, right? They started in Grasshopper and migrated to Dynamo. Mm-hmm. So any tips that you have for us Dynamo users that want to learn Grasshopper, that, maybe some direct translations that would help? I'm going to share some links that I know for, the Grasshopper manual, of course. I'll share that link in the chat, but anything else would be wonderful as well.
Yeah. So I'd recommend jumping in with both feet. And, and so let's look at the Discover page. I guess the first thing to understand is that the guides here are broken down in a very obviously Revit-like way. And so it's a good place to start, depending on how you want to approach things, because this is mostly written by Ehsan. And so you're going to find a lot of these things here are going to make a lot of sense to you from just a Revit point of view, maybe not as much of a Dynamo point of view. But if we go to Discover here, this manual, of course, is 200, a great way to learn Dynamo too, 200 examples that include both, on one page it's Revit or Dynamo example, and on the opposite page, facing page, is a Grasshopper example of the same thing. And so it's not only a great way to learn Dynamo and Grasshopper, but it's also a great way to kind of see how they in some ways they parallel each other, and where they parallel each other exactly, and where, like you'll find some definitions, it's a little bit more complicated in Dynamo than it was in Grasshopper, or vice versa. And so that's one place to look. Here's a example where Marcelo and Jeff were talking about the two, and they actually, I think Jeff runs a Dynamo definition and Marcelo does a Grasshopper definition, and so they're going back and forth. This is a very good one to get started with right here. So those would be two places for specific Dynamo combinations. Now, I guess we can talk about where Dynamo, the thing that makes Grasshopper pretty special is that it has Rhino geometry kernel in behind it. So if it's a heavy duty geometry thing, or you're changing the geometry of something, that's where Grasshopper is really, really good, because we can use Rhino's geometry kernel in the background to change the geometry on the fly. And so that's where looking at what problems you're trying to solve and trying to decide if you're going to use Dynamo or Grasshopper, there's a number of people that are trying to kind of get their head around that. That's a really good way to do it. There's a lot more, Dynamo has a lot more components in it, and especially when you get off into sheets and schedules and views and all those kinds of things that you do. Grasshopper, we don't have a lot of those kind of components, but and then the plugins for Grasshopper, you can bring those into Revit now. I saw some questions about Ladybug and Honeybee. Those work in Rhino, and they work in Grasshopper, and they work in Rhino-Inside.Revit. And some people, what they do is they're actually using Grasshopper, for instance, to take the Revit model and simplify it on the fly into Grasshopper or into Honeybee and Ladybug, so that you can ask for the analytical model from Revit, and Revit will hand that to Grasshopper, and then Grasshopper can hand that to Ladybug on the fly, for instance. But you can imagine that's like a geometry thing. We're kind of dumbing down the geometry and simplifying the geometry in order to get it ready for analysis, for instance. Does that help?
One other thing that I wanted to add is that, like, as a Dynamo user coming into Grasshopper, for the first time, if you look at the Grasshopper and sort of like all the ecosystem of add-ons and extensions that's available for it, it might feel a little bit daunting at first. That, hey, like, there's so many different options for me, but Grasshopper is super, super easy to learn. It's very intuitive. You have access to pretty much anything that you want to do inside Grasshopper. Somebody has already made an add-on for it. One of the nicest things about this transition is that in Dynamo, the core Dynamo sort of like features and stuff like that doesn't have a lot of components that deal with Revit. So you kind of depend on a lot of the add-ons and extensions that other people have created for Dynamo. That makes your definitions dependent on the sort of like packages that need to be installed on the different Dynamo distributions to be able to open your definition. Almost anything that you see right now in Rhino inside Revit that's Revit related comes shipped with Revit Rhino inside Revit. As a great example, all the material components that we have. And there's like some of these stuff we don't have, I guess, as many components as all the Dynamo extensions that add-ons have created for Dynamo, but the ones that are inside Grasshopper, in a lot of cases, I would argue that they actually work better and they have a lot more features to them, like the material components that I mentioned. You can pretty much do, and you can do pretty much anything that you want to do with materials with these components. They're pretty powerful. And sort of like the rest of the create components are also coming. Like that tab that Scott is showing, it's all material components. It only supports the generic right now, but we're testing this with the users to make sure that the workflows are comfortable. And then we'll add all the advanced shaders that Revit has supported as well in them very quickly too.
So one of the crazy workflows that we've been working on is so you can take bitmaps and you can take colors and lists of colors and you can generate material libraries through Grasshopper in Revit. And because you can run because Grasshopper has plugins for V-Ray, you can actually generate V-Ray materials, and you could actually generate them both at the same time, so they're synced up. So you'd have Revit materials and you have V-Ray materials that match each other to as much as they can between the two. So you can actually grab materials out of Revit, or you can generate new materials on the fly, and you can mess around with their color and the bitmap assets they use and things like that. So all through. The embarrassing part here is we actually in Grasshopper now have better coverage of Revit materials than we do of Rhino materials. So
well, looks like we have about a minute left. Do you guys have any final thoughts you want to share with the group before we head out?
Maybe just the forums, Scott, if you want to sort of like share.
Yeah. So the thing that's really, really important about all this is that this is all driven by your requests. So as you try it, please get back to us, because it's the only way we really move forward with this. If you come to the forums here, I'm on here, and Ehsan's on here, and Kike, who's another developer for us on Rhino Inside Revit, we're all on here. Please jump out here and give us the feedback. We can, Ehsan many times can whip up some really quick Python components to help out your problem in the short run, and then we can get them more officially in the product if we need to later. So highly, highly recommend. Come to our website, get it downloaded, and please participate on the forum, because it's really critical to helping us, meaning you and us, get this product to be right for what you need.
Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate having you guys here today. I know everybody else has. Loved the conversation that we had. Thank you everybody who participated in the chat. Don't forget to fill out your survey with a chance to win $25 next meeting in February. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what the meeting should be. We have yet to plan it. And don't forget to join our LinkedIn group, where, as Allison posted both those links in the chat. So don't forget, our recordings of previous sessions as well as this session will be up there very soon. So thank you all so much and have a great day.